So tell us about your first assignment in Indonesia.
Yes, I was sent to Indonesia as part of a team of 11 men who were there to design an electrical system for Java, the island of Java, which was the most heavily populated piece of real estate in the world at the time. Now, the reason we were going to Indonesia, this is in the early 70s, it was pretty obvious by then that Vietnam was going to fall. And the theory was the domino theory, that if Vietnam fell, then the rest of the Southeast Asian countries would fall too, and we had to stop that. We were losing in Vietnam. We had to figure out a different way, not the military solution. And Indonesia was seen as the key to this. Indonesia had a lot of oil, so that was important. It had a huge population of people. It was a very populated country. And it had the largest population of Muslims of any country in the world. And so there were many good reasons for us to go into Indonesia. So we went into Indonesia and did this study and these projections showing that if they built up their electrical system, if they took a huge loan from the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank and built up their electrical system, their economy would boom over the next 2 decades. And we arranged for the loan from the banks. And basically what we were doing was bringing Indonesia into our realm. We were saddling them with huge debts. We were going to use our own companies, and we did, to build these systems. So the money, we arranged for the World Bank to make a loan to Indonesia. The money came to our corporations in the United States. Indonesia ended up with all this amazing debt. Now, I should say, Mike, that I was the only person on that 11-man team that knew the subtleties of what we were doing. I was the only economic hitman. I was the economist. I was the one who did all the forecasts. I was the one to arrange the loans. That all fell on me. The other men on that team were designing power plants, were designing the highways and ports to bring the fuels in to fuel the power plants, designing transmission lines, distribution systems, that sort of work. And throughout the industry, when I talk about these other companies, the Bechtels, the Halliburtons, the Stone & Websters, the Charles T. Maines, and the World Bank, I want to make it very clear that the majority of the people working for those organizations are not economic hitmen. They are technicians, they're engineers, they're doing what they believe is their job of designing systems. But there's always somebody at the top, there's always somebody in that organization that has a complete understanding of what's going on. It's very few people. Most of these people are in the dark about this, and they shouldn't be in the dark about it. I mean, it should be pretty obvious to them what they're doing, as it should be pretty obvious to all of us in this country where our tax money is going. It isn't that obvious. The system is an amazingly subtle and an incredibly effective system.
But wasn't there one person on your team in Indonesia who did seem to have an inkling of that things weren't entirely right?
Howard Parker, retired executive with the New England Electric System. He'd spent his life resisting pressure from others, and he was a very bitter man at this point. He had never been promoted to where he thought he should be in the New England Electric System. He'd retired and come to work for Maine as a consultant, and he knew what we were trying to do. We were trying to inflate all these forecasts. I was given the assignment of making sure that I showed that economic and load electric power growth would grow something around 17% a year, which is a huge number when you compound this over 20, 25 years. Howard was determined that it wouldn't be more than 6 or 8%, as he said. That's the norm. And I kept arguing, but this isn't the norm. This is a country that's booming. And yeah, I talk in a great deal of detail about Howard and how angry he was. But from my standpoint, Howard was a bitter old man, and he hadn't got what he wanted out of life, and he wasn't going to be around there long. So what I wanted to do was learn all I could from him and basically take over his job. So he wasn't really coming from a highly principled area, in my perception. It wasn't. It was a question of stubbornness. It was a question of bitterness. And I thought, well, I'm a young man on the make, and I know what I'm supposed to do. And Claudine's told me, and I just don't want Howard to get in my way. But at one point, I had this realization that I all through this, I was going through tremendous qualms and guilt. I knew that what I was doing was not the right thing, but I was being well rewarded, and what I was doing was legal, and in fact praised by, people like Robert McNamara and people that I looked up to. And so at one point, Howard made it very clear to me that it didn't matter what I came up with for an economic forecast. If I came up with 17% economic forecast, then his electric load forecast would have been roughly in the same area. There's a very strong correlation between economic growth and energy growth in any country or any region. And so it was my job to come up with this high economic forecast, and then he was supposed to match his electrical load forecast to that. He made it very clear that he wasn't going to do that. Didn't matter what I came up with, he would come up with something between 5 and 10%, which he figured was reasonable. So suddenly this light went off, and I said, my God, I've been relieved of the guilt. I can do what my masters have told me to do, what Claudine's told me to do, what everybody's telling me to do, come up with these high economic forecasts, and he'll come up with the electric load forecasts that are the real ones, the reasonable ones. And so I'm off the hook. They'll have to follow his electric load forecasts, because that's what the system would have to be designed with. And they should follow the economic forecast, but if he doesn't follow the economic forecast, then the burden's off me. So I felt so relieved. Of course, when I got back to Boston, Howard left long before me, left Indonesia because he got very sick, so we had to send him home. And he said he had all the information, he could do the rest of his work from home. When I got home, my boss, who later became the president of Charles T. Maine, called me into the office, and he said, I'm firing Howard Parker. Doesn't matter what you say here now, what you do, I'm firing Howard Parker, because his forecasts are unreasonable. I understand, he said to me, that your economic forecast would justify much higher load forecasts, and that you now are in a position where you could develop those load forecasts. Is that correct? He said, and I said, yes, that is correct. He said, congratulations, you've just been promoted. I took it. I gave them the load forecast they wanted, and my star was bright. I eventually became a partner in the firm, chief economist with a big staff, wonderful people working for me, and it's all in the book. I was compromised at that point, beyond reconciliation.
But you would do things regularly, for instance, sticking with Indonesia, that would feed your doubt. For instance, if I remember correctly, in Indonesia, you went out with a local person there who took you to meet people who lived there, and they openly challenged in casual conversation some of the things you were doing.
That's correct. I've always liked people a lot, and originally I wanted to be a journalist, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I loved being with the people. So when I was in Indonesia, this young man, his name was Razzie, who I lived in the same house as him. He lived in the guest house. His mother ran the guest house where our team lived. And he introduced me to a lot of his friends, and I loved being with them, these Indonesian people. I learned to speak Bahasa Indonesia quite well at the time. And so I spent a lot of time with them. And yeah, they were quite radical. And there's a whole series in the book about some of the experiences I had with them, going to puppet shows, their politics, their anger at what we were doing in Vietnam. And I agreed with them, and they were quite stunned that I would agree with them so much. And they took me into these amazing, beautiful parts of the city, the old city of Bandung, which is in West Java. We were working out of Jakarta and Bandung, and I was traveling around a lot of Indonesia. I was always shocked by how there were no other foreigners in those parts of the city. No other foreigners really hanging out with the Indonesians. There were quite a few foreigners, oil company people and people like my own team. We all hung out at these private clubs and the fancy restaurants, but didn't hang out with the Indonesians very much. And I did, and I really, really enjoyed it. And they questioned me a lot, and they pointed out that Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, in 1954 had written a book called Civilization on Trial, which said that in the long run, the Muslim people are the biggest threat to capitalism, to the U.S. way. Back in 54, he said it isn't communism. That's not ultimately a threat because it's not spiritual enough. It's not based in any real strong principles. For a culture to succeed, it has to be very principled. And he demised the fall of capitalism, what he called the West, because he said ultimately we won't be that principled either, and that the Islamic world would rise up because they have these strong beliefs in spirituality, and they don't believe in usury, and they don't believe in lending money. And these young Muslims in Indonesia pointed that out to me and said, you know, you guys are in trouble. This is back in the early 70s, and they said, you know, the Muslim world is watching, and we don't like what we're seeing. It was an amazing forewarning for, you know, if you look at what's going on now in the world, the Muslims have become, you know, very powerful and very, very angry at us. And it isn't simply about religion by any means. The Muslim religion at heart is not an angry religion. It's a compassionate religion. But they're very angry because they see us as basically raping their world, pillaging it. And, you know, they were always quoting statistics to me. We have a statistic that we throw around in this country a lot, that 5% of the world's population, us, the American population, consumes 25% of the world's resources. Now, that really bothers most of the rest of the world, that we're like this great octopus that reaches out with its tentacles and brings all the resources into us, and look at the lives we lead, while 3/4 of the world lives in destitution. Every day, 24,000 people die of starvation. And 30,000 children die of curable diseases every single day. And the people who live in the places where that's happening are angry. And they see us, 5% of the world's population, bringing in 25% of its resources, while so many of them live tragic, destitute, miserable, suffering lives. Needlessly suffering. It doesn't have to happen. But an even more important statistic, I believe, is that of that 5% of the world's population, only less than 1% controls more of America's resources than the 90% at the bottom. So in fact, 25% of the world's resources are being funneled into this country essentially to serve 1% of 5% of the world's population. Terribly small. It's not even a pyramid. It's like a needle going up with a few very wealthy, very powerful people sitting on the top. It's created tremendous resentment around the world. It's what's created our insecurity. I would suggest that we will never be secure in this country, no matter how many guards we have at our airports, until we decide that we're going to be a lot more compassionate with the world. And what a great thing that is to do. That will bring us the security that we need, is when we start really opening ourselves up to the world and welcoming the world as brothers and sisters who we want to share the goodies with. And back in those days in Indonesia, these young Islamic people who I fell in love with and was working with saw all this. They anticipated it. And they warned me about it, and it was a very telling experience for me, very moving. And yet, I was seduced. Sex, money, and power was coming my way, man, and I was gonna take it, and I did, for too long.
So, what was your next assignment after that? What was the next big project you were saddled with, or country?
Yeah, after that, I kind of began spreading out and hiring other people to work with me. So I did a lot of work in the next few years in Panama, and I also went back to Indonesia to do the same sort of thing we'd done in Java, up on the island of Sulawesi, and Colombia, and Iran. So for 3 or 4 years, my time was very much split between those countries, and I would take other journeys into Egypt and Guatemala and many other places, and I began hiring. I mean, I became very popular within Charles T. Maine because I was going along with the system, and the World Bank was loving what I was doing, and I just kept expanding my department. I became a partner. I was making a lot of money, and for the company as well as for myself. So it involved quite a few countries. But you know, the ones that had the greatest impression on me after Indonesia were Panama and Iran, and then Saudi Arabia.
All right, I want to go into a little more detail on those, but first, you had spoken about how people on your team when you were in Indonesia didn't have a grasp of the bigger picture of what was going on there. You were the single person that did. Once you started expanding your staff, were other people who are part of your staff, did they have the big picture? And then also, what about people at the World Bank and these other large organizations that you're kind of a front company for? Did they have the big picture?